Oda finally showed us what Loki's fruit is, except in Oda fashion, he didn't actually fully show us, instead giving us only shadowy glimpses. But there's a lot we can surmise from Loki's powers, particularly with how they thematically tie into Norse mythology.
So,
let's explore Loki's mythical dull fruit and everything else to dissect in this chapter. On the cover, we see Jimbe working at an eel train station, selling bento to the rest of the Straw Hats. Of course, the idea of an eel train is very much Oda suralism, but the idea of selling bento boxes at a train station is very much a mainstay of Japanese culture. As you may know, a bento is a lunchbox stuffed with pre-prepared food, incredibly common at convenience stores and some shops as a way to get a balanced and healthy meal without the need to cook something complex at home or at a restaurant. These are common with children, especially as it's tradition for parents to make them bento that they can take to school so that their lunch is something healthier than just a sandwich, but they're also particularly popular at train stations, with adults being known as ikeben or fundamentally station bento. This is because a lot of people who are trying to go through train stations, particularly those that cross through other cities far away within the country, by taking the Shinkansen will eat on the train to make sure that they don't waste time while still eating a balanced meal. So in this case, Jimbe is selling the group station bento for the long journey ahead. The grim aspect, however, is that as the kanji reads, these are unagi bento, or in other words, eel bento, a common bento serving, but also kind of weird considering that the trains themselves are eels. Are the trains alive? However, given those eyes, or is this purely thematic? Maybe we shouldn't think that much about it. The straw hats, however, are all children, tying into that aspect of bento often being served for kids going to school. Though, in this case, Robin appears to be the older sister taking care of the purchase, while Luffy with his iconic shirt with 56 reading as Golu, Chopper, Nami, Usopp, Zoro, and Sanji are all depicted as children. As a neat detail, Zoro is depicted with a single sword, because he's so young that this was before he even picked up 3 swords. And Chopper is still depicted as a reindeer, as this would be before eating the fruit. We peek off right from where we left off, where we see Ragnar with a will of its own trying to attack Loki, which he barely dodges. As we have thought, Ragnar is indeed a hammer that has eaten a Zundel fruit and attained a will of its own. And as Harold explains, the reason the fruit is gone uneaten is because Ragnar has not yet deemed anyone worthy of eating it in all these years, testing anyone who would dare try to eat it, essentially being put there as a guardian to avoid anyone from attaining it. This actually relates to the original myth of Mjolnir, where it was said that the hammer was only lifted by very few individuals, primarily Thor and a couple of other exceptions in some myths. This myth evolved, however, over time into the idea that only those who are worthy may lift the Mjolnir, and Oda, in this case, twists the myth around to make it so that Ragnar is instead protecting the fruit and will only let those who are worthy take the fruit, although it will also let the worthy wield the hammer itself. Similarly, over time, the idea that the Mjolnir is incredibly heavy was also developed, reflected here in how the hammer crushes the entire floor of the room that leads to the door. Though it's possible that by its own will it was trying to shatter the floor to stop Loki. Loki tries to fight against the hammer with both of them wheezing out of tiredness if you pay attention to the speech bubbles. So they finish it with one last clash where Ragnar breaks Loki's hammer. However, this leaves quite the bruise on Ragnar. So the hammer admits defeat and directly shows Loki to the fruit. As we see this, Ragnar has seemingly eaten a Zuon fruit, being some kind of squirrel. If we continue with the connection of Norse mythology, then this is most likely the Ratatos, a squirrel that served as a messenger delivering messages between the Nirhager found at the bottom of the eagles that perch atop the tree, though not much more is known beyond that. This could make it the Rhizonomi or a squirrel fruit mythical model, Ratskar. But we could also be overthinking things, and maybe it's just a regular Rhizonomi and the connection is purely just symbolical. The odd thing is that Ragnar seems to be able to generate thunder as seen by the lightning bolt that Loki brought down at the start of Ragnarok, and the same one that he uses this chapter too. And while that is consistent with the myth of Mjolnir being able to summon thunder, it doesn't connect itself much to the concept of squirrels or the Ratatos. It's possible we have this backwards too, in that this is a squirrel that ate some kind of hammer fruit with thunder powers. But given the way that Oda has played with items eating zones before, that option definitely seems the one that is much more likely. This does make me wonder about the life longevity of items eating Zuen fruits, though, as it does seem the Ragnar has been protecting this fruit for a very, very long time. But after all, a hammer shouldn't age. Switching back to Harold the Gaban and Shanks both attempt to stop him, with both of them seemingly using Conqueror's Hakanim and Gavinmore properly explains the weakness of the God Knights, elaborating that, as we know, Conqueror's Haki impairs the regeneration that immortality provides. However, it doesn't stop it entirely, meaning that several Conqueror's attacks are needed in a row to properly stop someone from fully regenerating. Think of it in video game terms as someone who has an HP regen ability, but hitting them with certain attacks lengthens the cooldown of the HP regen, meaning that if you fully destroy their HP before the regen can keep up, they will die. And this is consistent with the idea we've been told so far that Haki can overcome the power of Devil, fruits such as Law being unable to use his powers to simply teleport someone, like Kite or Big Mom, into water due to their enormous Haki. So it makes sense that the powers of the Devil, which elate different, likely run on a similar power system as Druss, are also limited by some powerful enough Haki, which weakens them and slows them down to the point that they are not able to regenerate the bodies quickly enough before they are killed. It is, as Jimbe said, there is no such thing as an eternal power. This explains why Summers took a long time to regenerate after Gaban attacked him, but ultimately recovered because Gaban had no time to finish off Summers, as he was too busy saving the kids. So he just tried to incapacitate him for as long as possible, while he tried dealing with Goko first to free the kids. Given how we saw Saturn, though possessed by Emu, which likely bore him quite a lot, surviving a massive attack of Conquerors all at once, it seems this is more to do with consecutive attacks that he does with a single powerful attack all at once. Though I'm sure this has a lot to vary from individual to individual based on their strength and other elements. As I imagine, Harold's immense strength is also what is making things hard for Shanks and Gaban. The latter particularly mentions that Harold himself, being a conqueror, makes it harder for these attacks to hit, which is similar to what Roger and Gar mentioned, with Jab being a difficult opponent to hurt because of his conqueror's Haki, as after all, the Meversi involves pretty much the same system of regeneration that immortality does, it seems. So since Saturn is also a conqueror, that may be why he survived the mega attack on God Valley. And it's likely also why Luffy struggled with hurting the gods at Egghead, since he did attack them a few times, but not long enough to continuously kick up the assault and kill them. Gaban further elaborates that he became familiar with the Gun Knights as they attempted to seize Shanks from them, but they were unable to last again the powerful conqueror Haki of the Roger Pirates. Shanks claims to have heard the same story from Summers when he came back to the Holy Land, which finally explains Summers' trauma towards Gaban, which in the end was totally unrelated to God Valley. Anyway, as Ragnar gives Loki permission to eat the fruit, nodding and then happy that his duty has been fulfilled, we see Loki eating it, which funnily enough is incredibly tiny due to his giant size, since they were built for human measurements, but appears to have some spiky shape, appearing to look like a durian or a lychee. At this point, Loki transforms. Though, of course, Oda decides to shadow it, making it a bit tricky to determine what he transformed into, but let's try to decipher it. It does appear to be a Zoan, as we seem to witness Loki transforming into a large creature in what seems to be both its beast form and later its hybrid form as well. In his beast form, Loki appears to grow some kind of spiky fur or horns, while his hands instead become more canine-like and with nails at its ends. As he transforms, he lets out a powerful growl, which leads, as Bo being a fairly generic animal howl, to not make it too identifiable. The large black silhouette with shining eyes is hard to make out, particularly as it seems to stretch upwards, but it's hard to say how much of the black shape is just the shadow cast by it, or if this is an accurate outline to begin with, as at most we can really only tell apart what seems like some kind of claw at the bottom left. In the next panel, however, we see the silhouette running through the castle, and it appears to be running on all fours, suggesting it's a quadrupedal creature. The claws can be more clearly seen later as Loki slashes Harold and leaves large claw marks on his body. These marks actually match those seen in the throne room many chapters ago, in chapters like 1139, which we pointed out all the way back then, could point to the idea of Loki's fruit being some kind of mythical zone that left those claw marks. Indeed, we see Loki continue to slash and slam Harold until he grabs him by the head, showing the silhouette of what appears to be his hybrid form, While the hybrid form doesn't seem to show the helmet outline, it still has his ancient giant horns, which remember those are real, and while it keeps a more hominid shape, his head appears to have some form of snout. You can also very faintly make the outline of what looks like his gloves in the shadow, but his claws have extended within the gloves themselves. With these details, there's a couple ideas we can surmise about Loki's fruit. A very common popular one would be the aforementioned Nirhager, who would be a Ryorionomi dragon fruit mythical model Nirhager. In Norse mythology, this giant dragon is said to be a being that dwells at the roots of the Yggdrasil, knowing the tree from low below within what is Helm, the realm of the dead. This would fit with Loki being chained at the roots of the adamant tree, with the underworld being inspired by both Niflheim, the frozen realm, and Helheim, the realm of the dead. When Ragnarok begins, it is said that the Nirhager is unleashed carrying the dead in its wings. Though the dragon itself isn't so much tied with the causing of Ragnarok, unlike Loki or other individuals, but you could perhaps interpret it as Loki starring Ragnarok and thus then unleashing the dragon. What really drives the connection further, though, is the aforementioned Ratatoskr serving as a messenger for the Nirhagar, as well as more than anything that in One Piece the Nirhagar was written with a kanji of Thunder Dragon Ryu, thus inferring that he has thunder powers, which was seen in the nightmare creation generated by the children and Killing Gum's powers. And this would explain why Loki is able to generate lightning strikes with the Ragnar, as it would mean it's not a power of the hammer itself or its ability as a squirrel, but rather part of Loki's own mythical fruit, thus being able to summon lightning bolts with his powers as the Night Hoger. And then Ratatoskr is just able to channel it and is not affected because, well, it's a hammer. It's made of metal. The confusing thing is how Loki would be able to summon forth a lightning bolt while still being partially chained with sea stone. But as we've seen in the past with Luffy's fruit, for example, sea stone doesn't necessarily make Del fruit powers impossible, just heavily weaken the user. Though in cases like Loya, it does seem to make transformation impossible. Well, for zones like Luffy, his body remains stretchy and rubbery, even when submerged in water or with sea stone. So, it's hard to say if Loki's thunder generation could be limited by the chains, but if it was indeed just Ragnar's power, then that wouldn't be an issue. There is, however, another option, and it's one that I've suggested before with the claw mark several times, which would be the Fenrir, or would be an Inuinomi Dagdafrut mythical model Fenrir in Norse mythology. The Fenrir is a massive wolf born as a child of Loki in the myth of Ragnarok. One of the kickstarting events of the apocalypse is Loki burning down the Yggdrasil tree, which we see him do when he is partially freed by Luffy and Zoro. This event is foretold by Fimbulvetra, a cataclysmic winter that fall, as well as the arrival of Ragnarok, which in One Piece was seen with the Great Cold. That involved Albath following Loki's birth in the myth of Fenrir. The wolf helps Loki not just by burning the Yggdrasil, but most importantly, really, starts Ragnaroku by killing Odin, the leader of the gods. This would largely fit with connecting the fruit to Loki, particularly as Loki inches the land towards Ragnarok, kickstarting what would be the slow but eventual demise of the Third World. The fan would also match the spiky fur that Loki developed, as well as the claws, which appear a lot more cannon and sharp like those of a werewolf. Though it's hard to say since he could be mid-transforming, and the fact that his squad padded matches the Fender too, as the Nit Hoger, at least as it appeared in the children's nightmares, appear to have feet but also had wings instead of arms, unlike the claws that Loki uses here. And the silhouette of the hybrid form does seem to show a lot more the slender mud snout than the more voluminous jaw of a dragon. So on one hand, I'm more inclined to believe Loki has powers relating to the Fenrir than the Nidhogger, just because the solid matches more and there's better thematic connections with starting Ragnarok. But on the other hand, beyond the connections with the Ratatoskr, I can't ignore the fact that Nidhogger explaining the lining powers of the Ragnar would clarify a lot of things. Especially when you take into account the Nit Hugger being a lining dragon is not an element from Norse mythology, but rather a purely One Piece made creation, with Oda going out of his way to include a different kanji reading and showing the Nidhogger nightmare casting lining balls just to justify this power that, as far as I'm aware, isn't really taken from anywhere else, and mainly because when you think of it, if Loki is the Fanner, what exactly makes him that devastating of a power? In Norse mythology, Fenrir is just a big scary wolf, which sounds imposing, but for One Piece standards, how much different would that make him from someone like Jabra? On the other hand, instead the Nithagura is a dragon with the power to summon lightning, which we saw left a devastating mark on Albth with a power not too dissimilar to that of Anno, who already was seen had the ability to destroy small islands, although this was through the Spowers being aided by the Arc Maxim's machinery, which is heavily reminiscent then of Uranus' ability to destroy Lucia, and thus reminiscent of the drawing of the Harley with the dragon over the large tree with the thunder striking it, which we've taken this far for being the Dowel fruit tree Eve, the lightning coming from the ship representing more Uranus' strikes led by Emu, which causes the flooding seen in the wave to the side. But what if this dragon had some connection in all that, as we haven't yet explained the presence of this dragon, even though Loki should be more on the side representing the ancient giant. After all, we know that dragons are sort of secret to the celestial dragons. Not only are they named after them, but Kaido's devil fruit was originally in their possession after Kaido stole it, Vegapunk clone. His fruit, which eventually Monosuke and later went on to create artificial dragons in Punk Hazard under celestial dragon orders, and doesn't dragon number 13, which the Straw Hats fought, resembled the nightmare Knit Hugger quite a lot. So perhaps this fruit had a lot of value and importance in the Void Century, but was ultimately seized by the giants. Jabog seemingly wanted the fruit to be eaten by Harald to take down the government, which, to be fair, to lead an airborne assault on Marihua, a dragon, would be pretty ideal, while Emu similarly wanted Harald to eat the fruit to turn him into an unstoppable warrior. A mistake Mu may come to rue as Mu faces Loki in the present. So while the fan rear better matches the silhouettes and some connections, the Need Hager, despite some inconsistencies, could much more explain Loki's lining powers.
So,
It's all down to you in the end which one you think he will have, or if we're wrong entirely and it really is a whole other creature. But at the very least, we can be confident it's a Zoan and not something like the Gnomi. I do wonder though how this all connects with Loki's claim that he is the sun god who will bring forth the end of the world. But perhaps it really isn't connected to his fruit, but rather Loki simply believes himself as Na, given how he projected that onto Jabek previously, and the fruit is simply separate to it all. It doesn't matter, as Oda won't show us anyway, since Loki returns is his regular form. Harald regains some of his consciousness, as it seems that the Haki attacks have been undoing Emu's influence for a brief period of time, limiting in the same way that the regeneration is lagging behind. This again reinforces the idea that Conqueror's hack stops all of powers, not just the regeneration, much like with Delfruits. Weirdly enough, as Harald claims to be taken over, his abyss mark begins to change. An additional line or bone, for lack of a better term, appears to begin diagonally, which wasn't present previously with the last incarnation of the symbol we saw. Is this a drawing mistake, or is Oda suggesting that Harald's mark is being upgraded to the next tier as seen previously? Perhaps Emo is growing worried Harald might get killed and is upgrading him to the deep sea contract as a quick emergency measure to make him even stronger, and so that Emo can take over his body to fight Loki directly rather than just controlling him, which so far seems to be an exclusive Gorsei and Gongo power from what we've seen. And it's hard to think of it as a mistake given the zoom in on it with a dedicated panel with Harald claiming it's taking him over again. But I wonder if it means the mark is upgrading or if it's just taking more control. Though I do wonder why Amor the Gorsei didn't just use the abyss in the throne room, or if they just didn't account for that quickly enough. Thus, Loki has no other option but to kill his father, delivering the final hammer strike and thus summoning a powerful lightning bolt which crashes into Horus Castle's throne room, concentrating into the Ragnar, which finally explains the large hole in the roof we saw in the throne room when Shamrock and Gunko arrived, although it would seem the roof already partially ruptured earlier due to the damage Loki caused, as beginning from the panel of Loki in hybrid form. We can see snow falling around them and surrounding not just the throne room but also the entire castle and the rest of Albuff, as we see from a glimpse of the walrus skull. And I have to imagine this isn't related to Loki's powers but just to all of Albuff, as it appears to be snowing on a much larger scale. We've seen the symbolism of snow used several times to symbolize death, primarily during death, which could tie into the concepts of Fimbulvetr and the heavy snow associated with Norse mythology and northern lands in general. Regardless, the power of full thunder is accompanied by the body sound effect, which, as we've mentioned before, is the sound of thunder, which is often used to indicate the cracking of Haki. But in this case, it both serves to indicate the thundering hack as well as the thunder itself. Interestingly though, Harald smiles at Loki in his final moments as he tells him he loves him, with the smile often being a sign of contempt in death with inherited will. In the very final panels, Harald Install loses his grin, perhaps from the sheer impact alone and him overthinking things, but maybe ties into Loki's inability to carry on his wishes as Albuff becomes frozen in time for several years. As Loki kills Harald, we can see Shang skanging next to Jarl. As he said before, he wanted to try and save Harald, but realized he was not able to. Though once again, I wonder with them as witnesses why they kept the truth about Loki silent, particularly as Shanks would defeat and capture Loki at sea 6 years ago, around the same time he became a Yonko. After this day, though, the people of Albuff would assume that Loki murdered his father purely for violent reasons. His whole life, every single act of his was misunderstood. From birth, it was prophesied that Harald would be killed by his own son. But in the end, it seems that either was only a mere coincidence, a rumor spread by Astrida, or even a real foretelling like Charlie's but missing the actual context. He was blamed for killing the royal families like a horse, who implied it may have been due to the continuous abuse that Loki's mother and her brother caused on him. Loki was blamed for the cataclysms on Alb as well as Ural's death at Lilin's hands and the death of his own mother. Despite none of them really being his direct fault, Loki was blamed for unleashing the underworld's creatures on the villages of Albath that clearly was out of desperate bid for attention, even considering for feeding his life. He was blamed for setting a village on fire as a prank, but the truth is that he did it because those same people had killed his mother. And of course, the claim that he murdered his father in cold blood was so lacking the important context it required. This is not to say Loki may not have been a violent and irritable man as caused by his troubled upbringing, but it is clear that his kindness changed him, and deep down he simply wants to be accepted in a society that refuses to understand him. On the other instead, Harold was praised, beloved, and blindly adored. But he was naive and gullible, risking his people's future due to his own obsessiveness with accomplishing his goals. It's clear Harold is someone who struggles to focus on the opinions of others, even if not out of malice, as he never noticed much of Loki's abuse in him as a child, and he also ignored Edensol's warnings about joining the government. But in the end, he still owned up to his own mistakes and put everything on the line for the sake of the future of his country. For despite his misguided actions, that was always what he firmly believed in, and he kept believing in until his death. Perhaps Harold may not have been the perfect and adored king that people expected him to be, but a real flawed person with his own naivety and weaknesses. Yet much like his son, despite both being misunderstood in different ways, both held that love in their hearts that Ida had so dearly left behind. Mind.